Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a sweeping historical epic about one of Mesoamerica's most powerful, fascinating, and honestly, wildly misunderstood civilizations. We're going to deconstruct an empire of staggering wealth, incredibly intricate politics, and deep, profound cosmic beliefs. So get ready, because we're about to rethink everything you thought you knew about the absolute powerhouse that dominated central Mexico.
Okay, let's dive right into this. The very name we use for this civilization, it's kind of a historical illusion. The word Aztec is actually a totally modern invention. It comes from the Nahuatl word Aztecatl, which just means people from the mythical homeland of Aztlan. But the actual people who built this massive state, they literally never walked around calling themselves Aztecs. Plus, it wasn't even a single, unified Roman-style empire at all. At its core, the group we're actually talking about were the Nahuatl-speaking Mexica people. They were a specific ethnic tribe who migrated into the region and eventually became the ultimate power brokers of a really complex three-city alliance. So you might be wondering, who exactly were the Mexica, and how in the world did they get there?
Chapter 1. Origins of the Mexica.
To understand their dizzying rise to power, we've got to start by tracing the Mexica's journey from wandering, basically destitute outsiders to the absolute power players in central Mexico. See, the Mexica were actually latecomers to the basin. They descended from Chichimex migrants from the north, and they arrived in the valley around the year 1250, only to find that, well, all the good agricultural land was already taken by existing super powerful city-states. As total outsiders with very few resources, they had to scrape by. They ended up finding work as fierce mercenary warriors for a powerful city-state called Culhuacan. But wow, this arrangement ended in total disaster. The Mexica rulers actually asked the king of Culhuacan for his daughter to marry into their line. But instead of a wedding, and native accounts actually back this up, the Mexica sacrificed her to their god Zipetotec. As you can probably guess, the king was horrified. Enraged, his army chased the Mexica out by force, exiling them to a harsh, swampy island right in the middle of Lake Texcoco. But it was there, in that swamp, that they saw a sign from their gods, an eagle nesting on a nopal cactus. And so, in the year 1325, on that incredibly unpromising patch of mud, they founded their legendary city, Tenochtitlan.
Chapter 2. The Triple Alliance is born. So, how did this single, isolated island city-state build up so much political might? Well, for their first century, the Mexica actually paid tribute to the powerful Tepanec people of the city of Azcapotzalco. But then, in 1426, the Tepanec king Tizizamoc died. This plunged the whole region into a vicious succession crisis. A usurper named Maxila seized the Tepanec throne and just aggressively turned on all his rivals. He even had the Mexica ruler, Chimalpopoca, assassinated. And that was the spark. The new Mexica ruler, Izquapods, absolutely refused to submit. He allied Tenochtitlan with two other really disgruntled cities, Texco and Tlacopan. Together, they went to war and totally crushed Azcapotzalco in 1428. Following that huge victory, in 1430, these three victorious cities officially signed a treaty, creating what we now know as the Triple Alliance.
And the spoils of this new superpower, meaning the immense wealth and tribute flowing in from conquered provinces, were strictly and mathematically divided. It's a brilliant illustration of the power dynamic. The kings of Tenochtitlan and Texcoco each received two parts of the tribute, while the junior partner in the alliance, Tlacopan, got just one part. The three kings then took turns holding the supreme title of Elder Speaker, which meant they collectively held legal authority over all the other city-states they went on to conquer.
Chapter 3. The Mechanics of Hegemony.
Now, how do you actually run an alliance that spans such massively diverse territories, environments, and peoples? We've got to scale down from the macro level of the Triple Alliance right down to the micro level. The foundational building block of this entire system was the Altepetl, or local city-state, which was ruled by a dynastic king known as a Tlatoani. The absolute genius of the alliance here was that their rule was highly decentralized. They relied on a system of hegemonic or indirect control. When the alliance conquered an Altepetl, they generally didn't destroy its government. Instead, they left the local rulers in power, let them keep their local customs, and in return offered political stability. All the local ruler really had to do was agree to pay a semi-annual tribute to the alliance and supply soldiers for military campaigns. It was honestly an incredibly efficient way to scale an empire super fast without needing to maintain massive occupying armies everywhere.
What's truly fascinating here is how the deeply ingrained dualistic nature of Nahua cosmology physically manifested right in their government structure. In Tenochtitlan, there wasn't just one supreme ruler holding all the cards. The executive branch was actually split. You had the Huetlatuani, the paramount ruler who managed all the external issues like war, diplomacy, and empire expansion. But then you also had the Cihuacuaro. This translates to female snake, and this role acted somewhat like a prime minister or an internal viceroy, completely managing the day-to-day administration of the city itself. The Huetlatuani was associated with the male, dry season, while the Cihuacuaro was associated with the female, wet season. It was literal cosmic balance applied directly to city administration.
But as the empire expanded, the administration obviously had to become way more formalized to make sure all that wealth kept flowing. Emperor Moctezuma I instituted some sweeping reforms to solidify this pipeline of wealth. At the very top in Tenochtitlan sat the Petlacalcauts, the supreme central head of tribute. Below him were the Hucalpixil, basically high stewards, overseeing 38 specific tributary provinces. And then right on the ground were pairs of Calpixil, or direct tribute administrators. One stayed in the province to collect the goods, and the other stayed in the capital to manage storage. This system was brilliant. Why? Because it allowed the alliance to tax the commoners directly, effectively bypassing those local dynastic kings whenever they needed to, just to completely secure the empire's absolute lifeblood, its tribute.
Chapter 4. Gods, Blood, and Cosmos.
We really can't understand this massive administrative expansion without understanding the deeply spiritual worldview that was actually driving it. Warfare for the Mexica wasn't just about grabbing land or wealth, it was a profoundly sacred responsibility. Unlike European military tactics of the era, which pretty much prioritized slaughtering the enemy right on the battlefield, Mesoamerican warfare, and Aztec warfare specifically, was fundamentally focused on capturing enemies alive. Taking a prisoner was literally the ultimate military achievement. And why is that? Well, because live captives were deemed absolutely vital for the sacrificial rituals that the Mexica believed were necessary to sustain divine favor. A soldier elevated his social standing not by how many men he killed, but by how many live prisoners he brought back to the capital.
This sacred approach to combat culminated in the institution of the Flower Wars. Now, these were not chaotic land grabs. They were highly ritualized, strictly prearranged battles between specific city-states, and their sole purpose? To secure a steady, healthy supply of captured warriors for sacrifice. The alliance waged these intensely against their arch-enemies in Tlaxcala. Native accounts tell us these wars were heavily instigated by a powerful Cihuacoat named Tlacael in response to a horrific 4-year drought that hit the basin in 1450. Tlacael basically elevated the militant patron sun god Huitzilopochtli and argued that humanity was currently living in the age of Ollantaytamteuch, the sun of movement. If the sun wasn't fed with continuous blood sacrifice, they believed the world would literally end. Therefore, these wars were framed not as typical political skirmishes, but as an absolute cosmic necessity to stave off the apocalypse. Just imagine believing the literal survival of the universe rested entirely on your military campaigns.
Chapter 5. The Conquest Reconsidered.
And this brings our narrative to its dramatic, almost inevitable climax. It's time to reconsider the fall of the empire and, frankly, bust the pervasive European savior myth surrounding the Spanish conquest. The traditional story we're often told paints Hernán Cortés and his few hundred Spanish soldiers as these miraculous conquerors who toppled a massive empire all by themselves. But the reality, as clearly shown by the historical record, is entirely different. Remember that system of indirect rule and heavy tribute taxation we were just talking about? Yes, it was incredibly efficient, but it also created a very fragile web of deeply resentful client states. So when Cortés landed in 1519, he didn't find a unified, fiercely loyal empire ready to repel him. Instead, he found a heavily fractured landscape of people who were completely desperate to throw off the heavy yoke of Tenochtitlan. Through his translators, Cortés expertly exploited these local grievances, convincing tributary states like the Totonacs and those arch-enemies like the Tlaxcalans to ally with him against their Mexica overlords.
So the absolutely crucial point here is this staggering number, 100,000. After suffering some initial defeats in the capital, Cortés retreated, recovered, and eventually marched back to besiege Tenochtitlan. But he wasn't just leading a few hundred Europeans. No way. He actually commanded an overwhelming army of up to 100,000 indigenous warriors. The vast overwhelming majority of the soldiers who actually brought down the Aztec capital were not Spanish at all. They were Tlaxcalans, Texcocans, Totonacs, and other local peoples who had simply had enough of the Triple Alliance's punishing demands.
But, of course, military alliances alone didn't seal Tenochtitlan's fate. We really have to acknowledge this incredibly somber statistic. Following the Spaniards' initial retreat from the city, a devastating smallpox outbreak struck Tenochtitlan. Because the indigenous populations of the Americas had zero previous exposure to the disease, the results were just catastrophic. That outbreak alone killed more than 50% of the region's population in a matter of months. And among the dead was the newly elected emperor himself, Cuitlahuac. This unprecedented biological disaster completely, fundamentally broke the Alliance's physical ability to resist the impending siege.
And so we arrive at the profound paradox of the Aztec Empire, the very system that allowed a band of wandering, destitute mercenaries to build a continent-spanning powerhouse in just a century. It was the exact same system that ensured its rapid, fiery destruction. Their indirect hegemonic rule allowed for brilliant, incredibly fast expansion, but it also planted the seeds of rebellion in literally every province they conquered. When the Spanish arrived, they merely lit the match. It really leaves us to wonder, if an empire builds its strength solely on the tribute and subjugation of its neighbors, how long can it truly expect to survive before the periphery turns on the center? These systems of hegemony and rebellion reflect universal themes of power that are just as fascinating and, honestly, just as relevant today. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning history.